Now, Matthias, you told me a brief story about how your father made you read, and I'm going to do a really bad job at pronouncing his name. Maybe you can help me. Pyotr Kropotkin?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I don't speak Russian myself. I think I've learned his last name is Kropotkin, but there's probably some Russian who's going to say that I'm butchering it too. So.
Very good. Now, now he wrote a book back in 1902 called Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. And you had some thoughts about his theories, and you were saying that you actually know some Serbians who filled you in on some things?
It was when I mentioned that it looks like scientists of various fields, especially biology, seem to be sort of uncovering through looking at, for instance, different behavioral patterns in animals and also human psychology, for that matter, that that mutual aid, in a sense, seems to be part of our sort of basic fabric as humans. We tend to cluster in groups, and we tend to be more favorably inclined towards, for instance, generous individuals. And some studies have shown that those who cheat in various kinds of games are typically excluded from the group at some point, and such things. So I would say that largely it kind of looks like that humans and many other animals, obviously, of course, primates and other monkeys, they tend to go in the direction of mutual aid. When I gave a talk in Iceland at the International Saga Conference that took place in August in 2018. And you will have to forgive my language, but the title of the paper was "Worthy Vikings Assholes." And this comes from a book on the social asshole. I believe he's a philosopher from Stanford or Harvard. I don't remember exactly, but he wrote a book, Assholes, a Theory. And there he sort of outlines what is sort of this social pariah who manages to go through society by committing these deeds that we would classify as the deeds of an asshole. And I asked myself that question: Are Vikings, as they are represented in the saga literature, those kinds of people? And one of the things I was looking into in that regard was both, first, this biological function. It looks like that we can find, for instance, in capuchin monkeys that, you punish people who, break the rules in different ways. You punish individuals who take resources from others. And you especially punish those who hoard resources for themselves exclusively. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily just manage to, divvy up resources equally between all capuchin monkeys present, but it does mean that there is this tendency in some of our, very, very distant evolutionary cousins to punish such behavior. And when we then start looking into that Viking Age society, there are some factors we should consider. First of all, it's a migrant society. And is one of the things that the students of the saga literature from Iceland often note is that, whoa, this literature is very similar to sort of our Wild West narratives here in the US. And we have the same types of like outlaws. We have the village people who are being harassed by some kind of villain, and all of these things. And what behavioral psychology seems to have uncovered lately is that various types of societies that are these migrant societies actually rate higher on this scale of individualism as opposed to collectivism and communal living. The United States is a good example of this. The northern island of Japan, Hokkaido, is another example of this, where we have a very strong individualistic society compared to a very collectivist society in Japan, in the rest of Japan. And that comes from the migrations, because Hokkaido was sparsely populated in the 19th century. And then the Japanese government decided to move people into the area to bolster the border between them and Russia that was expanding eastwards. And this created an entirely different type of Japanese up there, simply. And so I asked myself, well, is there something similar going on in Iceland? And in this period from 870 to 930, as the historical records tell us that people migrated to Iceland, what is happening here? And I would say that to an extent, Iceland does seem to exhibit similar tendencies of individualistic behavior, a sort of a tendency to be less interested, at least in a portion of the population, to be less interested in various forms of communal living. And if we take the saga literature as examples of this, what we typically see are individuals who behave very, well, what you might define as assholes, basically. Like these people who do not give much regard for the feelings and safety and such for other people, but are advancing their own cause solely. And that ranges from the level of the villain who's just mentioned in one chapter and then killed off in the next one, to the hero of the saga himself.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. So let me ask you, would you say that if certain individuals were assholes, that the non-assholes would have gotten together to sort of combat whatever evils the assholes created?
Well, that might be the case in different ways. So a little bit about the history of Iceland. First of all, the time frame of the migration period that I just mentioned from 870 to 930 is not correct, actually. We have found archaeological evidence that there was already some kind of Nordic presence in Iceland in the beginning of the 800s, so that's 70 years before then. And another thing that we should consider is that with this literature that is strongly focused on migrants from Norway, comes actually a sort of a disproportionate representation of Scandinavians in the early Icelandic society. Genetic studies of early Icelanders indicate that we have an almost 50-50 split between Scandinavians and people from the British Isles, primarily Scotland and Ireland. So that means then that we, in a sense, also have a multicultural society in the beginning. And these factors, of course, have some kind of impact on the direction society takes. Adding to this, we should consider that the earliest sources that talk about the migration, that would be the Ari Fróði's Book of Settlements and the Book of Icelanders. These are from around 1120. And what he tells us there is that about 415 to 17, in that range, were the original settlers who took land. Now, obviously, that's a very low number. Estimates of the early population of Iceland from the migration period and sometime into the medieval period suggest somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people. So what we have are 415 to 17 individuals who are mentioned, and then all the rest. And what happened to all the rest? Well, we don't know, or we don't know that much, at least, right? They're at least not considered important enough to be mentioned in the book of settlements in particular, which goes through the histories of all of these individuals. Now, with these migrations, let's say a Viking ship of the type that they would use to cross the Atlantic could hold somewhere between 20 and 30 people, maybe. If these migrants, they each had a ship holding 30 people, I think we end up somewhere around 12,000, right? If I do my math correctly. I am a literature major, so don't hold that against me. So there's a lot of history in that regard that is lost to us. And there's also aspects of land ownership that we don't really fully understand in that early period. We have to, of course, realize that the saga literature is written in the 13th century. It gives us everything from what seems to be relatively reasonable historical accounts with, aspects of fantasy and other things mixed in there. But there are also sagas that are completely fantastical, and you meet giants and dragons and all kinds of curious things. One of the things we see with the saga literature is that it often mentions that people left Norway because of the aggressions of Harald Finehair, the king who's said to started basically assembling the Norwegian kingdom. And so, in a sense, what we're seeing there in the 870s is a king who's starting to monopolize power. And then we have these chieftains, landholders in different regions of Norway who then decide to leave. That's what the sagas tell us, the sagas from the 13th century. But if we go back to the literature, the historical literature from the 1120s, we don't really see any indications of that actually being their motivation. There's no real motivation mentioned. So we have, when we deal with this material in a source critical way, we have a discrepancy between earlier sources and later sources in what they are telling us about the relationship of the migrants to Iceland to this ideas of rulership and individuals trying to monopolize power.